Corporate America does not stab you in the back. It outsources the knife and then charges you for the dry cleaning. They threw $10,000 at my feet and expected me to vanish into the Seattle rain. But when you teach someone the exact architecture of your lies, you better pray they never return holding the sledgehammer. This is how I turned a petty termination into a $320 million corporate guillotine. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for your continuous support, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero operating budget to keep the lights on. If you find today's story compelling and want to help us survive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join our inner circle by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, grab a drink and settle in, because it is time to see exactly how Brooklyn Howard orchestrated her absolute masterpiece of corporate vengeance. It was a Monday morning in Seattle. The rain was coming down in thick, gray sheets, washing the color out of the city. I stood in the expansive glass and steel lobby of the Aegis Horizon Logistics headquarters. The floor was polished marble, reflecting the cold fluorescent lights above. I approached the security turnstiles, a routine I had performed thousands of times. I pulled my badge from my coat pocket and tapped it against the scanner. A sharp red light flashed. The screen read, "Access denied." I frowned. I tapped it again. Red light, access denied. This made zero sense. I was the supply chain risk compliance manager. I literally audited the security protocols for this building. I raised my hand to signal the guard at the front desk, but before I could speak, the heavy glass security doors slid open from the inside. Chloe stepped through. Chloe was a mid-level human resources representative who possessed the most perfectly calibrated, dead-eyed industrial smile I had ever seen. She wore a pristine beige trench coat and carried a thick beige manila envelope. She was not alone. A large, unsmiling security contractor walked one step behind her, his arms folded tightly across his chest. "Good morning, Brooklyn," Chloe said. Her voice was bright, chirpy, and completely hollow. "We need to have a brief chat right here, if you do not mind." She did not invite me up to an office. She did not offer me a seat. Right there, in the middle of the main lobby with morning commuters rushing past. She handed me the beige envelope. I pulled out a single sheet of heavily watermarked paper. It was a notice of immediate termination. I stared at the black ink. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I just closed out a spotless quarterly audit." "The company is undergoing an operational restructuring," Chloe recited, her smile never wavering. "Your position has been eliminated, effective immediately. We appreciate your 5 years of dedicated service." Operational restructuring. It was the ultimate corporate cowardice, a sterile, meaningless phrase designed to legally insulate them from wrongful termination lawsuits. "You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings," the security guard grunted. They marched me upstairs like an embezzler. 15 short minutes. That was all the time I was permitted to dismantle 5 years of grueling, 80-hour work weeks. The guard hovered inches from my shoulder while I swept photos and pens into a cardboard box. I was explicitly forbidden from logging into my computer. I was forbidden from opening my email to say goodbye. The walk back across the open-plan office floor was agonizing. The silence was absolute. Dozens of people I had trained, mentored, and protected suddenly found their monitors incredibly fascinating. Nobody looked up. Nobody met my eye. In corporate America, a fired employee is treated like a highly infectious disease. Before I reached the elevator, Chloe handed me a final settlement document. The severance package was exactly $10,000. After taxes, it was a pathetic, insulting payoff. It was hush money to ensure I vanished into the background without raising a fuss. I walked out through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the freezing Seattle downpour. I did not even make it to my car before my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated notification forwarded to my personal email from the Aegis Horizon payroll department. They were adjusting my final payout. They were deducting exactly $65 from my severance check. The reason listed on the invoice, failure to return company property. They were charging me for a cheap plastic ID badge clip and an aluminum water bottle with the company logo printed on the side. I sat slumped behind the steering wheel of my beat-up Honda Civic. The rain hammered against the roof like a drum. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. 5 years of flawless service. 5 years of keeping this company fully compliant with vicious federal regulations. And they were nickel and diming me for $65 on my way out the door. My phone vibrated again. A text message lit up the dark interior of the car. It was from a trusted colleague, sent from a burner number. The truth finally spilled out across the glowing screen in gray text bubbles. There was no operational restructuring. The entire department was intact. I was pushed out onto the street for one specific reason. They needed to clear the path, the salary, and the title for a man named Julian Vance. Julian Vance was not a logistics expert. He was not a compliance officer. He was an arrogant, entirely inexperienced outsider, but he possessed one qualification that outweighed my entire career. He was the brand new son-in-law of a senior board member. I read the text message 3 times. My blood ran completely cold. Julian Vance had never worked a day in supply chain logistics. I knew for an absolute fact that he had never even glanced at the federal guidelines for transporting hazardous materials. He would not know the difference between a Class 3 flammable liquid and a pallet of bottled water. I had spent 5 years bleeding for that company, painstakingly building a foolproof safety architecture to prevent catastrophic environmental disasters and massive federal fines, and now they had handed the keys to that highly explosive, legally perilous system over to an entitled amateur who just wanted a corner office. They thought I would just take the $10,000 and cry myself to sleep. They thought they had tied off a loose end. But sitting in that freezing car, looking at the $65 deduction receipt, the shock finally evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They did not just fire me, they handed me the exact blueprints to their future destruction. The clarity I found in my car that rainy morning was a temporary anesthetic. The reality of the American job market is a completely different kind of monster. It does not attack you outright. It simply starves you to death in a locked room. For 8 agonizing months, I stared into the void, and the void offered absolutely nothing in return. I submitted hundreds of meticulously tailored resumes. I navigated endless rounds of digital assessments, personality quizzes designed to weed out the desperate, and video interviews where I forced myself to smile until my facial muscles physically cramped. The result was always exactly the same: a deafening, suffocating silence, followed weeks later by automated emails that all read like they were generated by the same soulless machine. Thank you for your interest in the position, but we have decided to move forward with candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs. It is a very specific, deeply humiliating kind of psychological torture, watching your entire professional worth be systematically reduced to a polite, automated rejection sitting in your junk folder. My financial runway evaporated faster than I could have ever calculated. That pathetic $10,000 severance check was swallowed whole by rent, groceries, and bare minimum survival. Within 4 months, my savings accounts hit zero. I had to pack my entire life into a few cardboard boxes and abandon my bright, spacious downtown apartment for a cramped, mold-smelling studio in a neighborhood where the streetlights were permanently broken. Then, the Honda Civic had to go. I sold it for a fraction of its Blue Book value just to keep the electricity turned on and avoid the crushing weight of total, inescapable bankruptcy. I was rationing cheap instant noodles and walking miles in the rain just to use the free internet at the public library. It was during one of those endless, sleepless nights, staring up at the yellow water stains on my ceiling, that my phone vibrated with a rare email alert. It was an offer letter. It was not a good offer. In fact, it was practically an insult. The company was Vanguard Praxis Partners, a brutally aggressive private equity and audit firm based out on the East Coast. They were notorious in the financial sector. They were corporate vultures, specializing in hostile takeovers, aggressive corporate mergers, and gutting distressed assets for parts. They needed a low-level legal review analyst. The starting salary was absolutely miserable, barely enough to cover rent in their expensive zip code, and the benefits were virtually non-existent. It was a starting from scratch, bottom-of-the-barrel position. I did not even hesitate. I typed out my acceptance email at 3 a.m. Survival strips away your professional ego very quickly. I relocated to the East Coast with 2 suitcases and a heart full of cold, hardened resolve. The environment at Vanguard Praxis was toxic by design. It was an absolute meat grinder built to break the weak. I was thrown into the windowless basement of the legal review department, a place where ambitious careers went to die under mountains of paperwork. My new reality consisted of grueling 80-hour work weeks. Monday through Sunday bled together into one continuous, fluorescent-lit nightmare. I lived on burnt office coffee and stale vending machine protein bars, drowning in tens of thousands of pages of incredibly dense, painfully dry merger contracts. My job was to verify commas, cross-reference obscure tax liabilities, and highlight potential regulatory red flags before Vanguard Praxis swallowed another distressed company whole. But Vanguard Praxis did not realize they had just hired a wounded animal with nothing left to lose. They thought I was just another desperate corporate drone. They did not know they had brought in an apex predator who had already been trained by the most sophisticated liars in the logistics business. While the other junior analysts blindly skimmed documents, just trying to hit their daily page quotas and go home to sleep, I hunted. I knew exactly how corporate executives hid their dirty secrets, because I used to build the very systems that kept them fully compliant. I knew where the bodies were buried in corporate balance sheets. I started catching catastrophic issues that everyone else, including senior partners, completely missed. During my 3rd month, I found a deeply hidden environmental liability buried under 7 layers of shell company appendices in a massive manufacturing buyout. If Vanguard Praxis had signed that paperwork, they would have instantly inherited tens of millions of dollars in strict federal cleanup fines. I flagged it. The deal was halted, and the firm was saved from a catastrophic financial loss. 2 weeks later, I identified a massive, unrecorded pension deficit disguised as a routine restructuring cost in a regional healthcare merger. I was pulling the firm back from the edge of toxic, disastrous deals, one contract at a time. The noise I was making down in the windowless basement eventually echoed all the way up to the top floor. That was when I met Sterling. Sterling was the overarching managing partner of Vanguard Praxis. He was a man who spoke entirely in profit margins, possessed absolutely zero empathy, and valued ruthless, mechanical efficiency above all other human traits. He did not care about my educational background. He did not care about my age, and he certainly did not care about my personal feelings. He only cared that my almost supernatural instinct for finding hidden compliance landmines was saving his private equity firm hundreds of millions of dollars. You see the traps before they are even set. Sterling told me during a brief, completely clinical meeting in his corner office overlooking the city skyline. Most compliance officers look at what is on the paper. You look at what is missing from the paper. I need that specific vision at the very top of my food chain. Under Sterling, my ascent was meteoric. I was promoted past analysts who had been there for a decade. I moved from the windowless basement to a glass-walled office, and within 2 years, I was officially named the Chief Compliance Officer for the entire firm. I became the final, absolute gatekeeper for every single acquisition Vanguard Praxis executed. I held the keys to the kingdom. And throughout that entire, brutal climb to the top, I maintained absolute silence about my personal history. I never spoke the name Aegis Horizon out loud. I scrubbed my professional profile of any deep connections to their executive team. But I never took my eyes off them. Every single night, after my 80-hour week was done, I logged into secure financial terminals. I pulled their public filings. I meticulously tracked their internal financial reports, their quarterly earnings, and their shifting logistics network. I watched Julian Vance flail in his undeserved executive chair from 3,000 miles away. I monitored every subtle tremor in their infrastructure, patiently waiting in the shadows, sharpening my knives, and preparing for the exact day the wind would finally blow them back in my direction. 3 years passed. My life had become a meticulously structured, high-velocity routine of corporate warfare. The miserable basement office was a distant memory, replaced by the relentless, high-stakes environment of the executive floor. Then, on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the ghost of my past walked right into my new reality. Sterling called me into his sprawling corner office, one of our most important VIP clients. A massive venture capital firm named Crestview Capital was preparing to execute a highly aggressive acquisition. The target was a prominent logistics company dominating the Pacific Northwest region. The finalized purchase price was set at a staggering $320 million. The target company was Aegis Horizon Logistics. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair opposite Sterling. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my face remained a flawless, unreadable mask. "Brooklyn," Sterling said, sliding a thick black leather binder across the polished mahogany desk. "Crestview is eager to get this done. They want the paperwork finalized and the money wired in under 30 days. However, the commercial transportation sector is historically a massive minefield for hidden environmental liabilities and structural debt. I want you acting as the third-party external chief compliance officer for the entire diligence process. I want you to tear their infrastructure down to the studs, look under every single rock, and tell me if the foundation is rotting." I reached out and took the binder. "I will handle the audit personally," I replied, my voice steady and cold. That night, I locked the door to my office and logged into the Aegis Horizon virtual data room. A data room is a highly secure cloud server holding millions of pages of internal corporate data, accessible only to the lawyers and auditors involved in a merger. For any normal compliance officer, a data room of this magnitude is a dark, terrifying, endless labyrinth of legal jargon and obfuscated numbers. But for me, it was exactly like walking back into my childhood home. I knew exactly where every digital hallway led. I knew exactly how the filing architecture was supposed to look, and more importantly, I knew exactly what was supposed to be there when I left it behind 3 years ago. I bypassed the heavily manicured financial summaries and the polished marketing presentations. I went straight for the raw, unpolished operational logs. Specifically, I targeted the hazardous materials classification matrices. It took me less than 3 hours to find the first glaring anomaly. The foolproof safety architecture I had painstakingly built over 5 years had not just been slightly modified, it had been completely lobotomized. Crucial safeguard protocols had been bypassed. Mandatory reporting triggers were disabled. I dug deeper into the granular supply chain manifests for the past 6 financial quarters. There was a massive, terrifying discrepancy in their handling of depleted lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion waste is incredibly volatile. If it is improperly packaged or transported in unregulated temperatures, it can easily spontaneously combust, causing catastrophic chemical fires that cannot be extinguished with water. Because of this extreme risk, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency mandates strictly controlled, highly expensive disposal protocols. Aegis Horizon had been moving thousands of tons of this highly toxic material for a major international technology client, but their operational expenses for hazardous disposal were impossibly low. They were reporting transportation costs that were literally 60% below the national industry average. I pulled the actual EPA permits attached to those specific freight lines. On the surface, they looked absolutely flawless. The federal watermarks were crisp, the certification numbers aligned perfectly with the standard formatting, and the authorization stamps looked completely legitimate. But when I ran the PDF documents through Vanguard Praxis's proprietary, military-grade forensic software, the digital footprint told a completely different, deeply criminal story. The embedded metadata revealed the truth. These were not original, government-issued permits. They were highly sophisticated digital composites. They were absolute forgeries, stitched together using old, expired license numbers and digital photo manipulation. I cross-referenced the digital author of the forged documents. The user identification code belonged to Julian Vance, but Julian was far too incompetent to orchestrate a systemic, company-wide fraud of this scale on his own. He needed high-level authorization to continuously bypass the internal auditing software month after month. I followed the digital approval chain upward, tracing the security overrides back through the system hierarchy. Every single forged permit, every single unauthorized freight movement, had been manually cleared by Marcus Thorne, the chief operating officer of Aegis Horizon. The motive was brilliantly greedy and crystal clear. By illegally transporting and dumping volatile lithium-ion waste through uncertified, cheap, black market carriers, Marcus and Julian had artificially slashed their operating expenses by millions. This falsely inflated the company's profit margins on paper, which in turn artificially drove up the overall valuation of the entire company right before Crestview Capital initiated the buyout. They were fattening the pig with toxic waste right before taking it to market. If this $320 million deal successfully closed, Marcus and Julian would walk away with tens of millions of dollars in executive stock bonuses. Meanwhile, Crestview Capital would unknowingly inherit a ticking time bomb of massive federal environmental crimes and guaranteed bankruptcy. My professional obligation, the exact reason Sterling paid me a massive salary, was to immediately flag this massive fraud, halt the acquisition process, and protect the client from buying a toxic asset. A single urgent email to Crestview Capital would kill the deal instantly. Aegis Horizon would face immediate regulatory scrutiny. The stock price would absolutely plummet, and the executives might eventually get fired or quietly asked to resign. But simply killing the deal was nowhere near enough. Getting them fired was exactly what they had done to me. It was too clean. It was too easy. It lacked the necessary absolute destruction. I did not want to just stop the transaction. I wanted them to feel the exact, agonizing moment the floor completely collapsed beneath their feet. I wanted them to pay with their entire careers, their personal bank accounts, and their literal freedom. I needed them willingly locked into a legal cage from which there was zero possibility of escape. So, I did not sound the alarm. I stayed dead silent. I became a ghost lurking in their machine. Over the next 48 hours, I methodically navigated through their hidden backup servers. I bypassed their amateur encryption protocols and quietly downloaded the original, unedited transport manifest that Julian mistakenly thought he had permanently deleted. I pulled the time-stamped internal emails between Julian and Marcus openly discussing the massive cost savings of using the illegal transport routes. I compiled every single piece of damning metadata, every forged signature, and every bypassed protocol into an impenetrable, encrypted offline drive. I was not just auditing a company. I was independently building an airtight federal prosecution file. I decided to let the clock keep ticking toward the final closing date. I was going to let them walk all the way to the absolute edge of their $320 million victory lap, and then I was going to personally push them over the cliff. The return to Seattle felt entirely different this time. I did not arrive in a beat-up Honda Civic, and I was not wearing an off-the-rack department store blazer. A heavy, armored black executive town car glided smoothly to a halt directly in front of the expansive glass and steel lobby of the Aegis Horizon headquarters. The driver promptly stepped out and opened the rear door for me. I stepped onto the pavement wearing a dark charcoal, razor-sharp bespoke suit that cost more than my entire original severance package. Hanging around my neck on a thick silk lanyard was a solid black, titanium-reinforced access badge. It was the highest-level vendor clearance pass in existence, granting me absolute unrestricted access to every single floor, server, and locked door in the entire building. I was the external auditor representing the single largest financial transaction in the history of the company. I possessed the ultimate power of life and death over their corporate future. I walked through the revolving doors and approached the front security desk. The young receptionist glanced up, prepared to offer a standard greeting, but her voice completely caught in her throat. She recognized me immediately. Her eyes darted frantically from my face to the black VIP badge resting against my chest. She fumbled with the telephone receiver, her hands visibly trembling, trying to alert the executive suite. Before she could dial, the heavy glass elevator doors on the ground floor chimed and slid open. Chloe stepped out. She was wearing the exact same beige trench coat, carrying a stack of new employee orientation folders, and wearing that exact same dead-eyed, perfectly calibrated industrial smile. She looked up. We locked eyes across the polished marble floor. I did not break my stride. I walked directly toward her. The psychological impact was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. I watched in real time as the blood completely drained from Chloe's face. Her flawless industrial smile instantly shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Her hands shook so violently that the orientation folders slipped from her grasp, spilling white paper all over the spotless floor. She realized instantly that the woman she had practically marched out of the building like a criminal was now holding the reins of the $320 million chariot. "Good morning, Chloe," I said. My tone was bright, crisp, and flawlessly professional. "I believe the executive committee is expecting me on the top floor. Please do not worry about the mess. The janitorial staff will take care of it." I stepped past her frozen, trembling figure and entered the elevator, pressing the button for the executive suite. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom, the atmosphere inside was thick with nervous anticipation. Marcus Thorne, the chief operating officer, was seated at the head of the long mahogany table. Julian Vance sat nervously to his right. Marcus immediately stood up, attempting to project an aura of dominating, condescending authority. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, plastering a patronizing smirk across his face. "Brooklyn," Marcus said, his voice booming with false warmth. "I must admit, when Crestview Capital told us who they were sending to run the final compliance check, we were quite surprised. It is always nice to welcome alumni back to the fold." I did not smile back. I walked gracefully to the opposite end of the long table, placed my leather briefcase down, and took the seat directly facing him. I did not acknowledge his patronizing welcome. I simply opened my laptop. "Good morning, gentlemen," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "We have a massive amount of ground to cover before the acquisition closes, and Vanguard Praxis requires absolute transparency. Let us begin immediately by pulling a random extraction of your hazardous materials transportation reports for the third quarter." The patronizing smirk instantly vanished from Marcus's face. He stumbled over his next words, his dominant posture crumbling into sudden, defensive rigidity. "The third quarter. Well, as you know, those files are incredibly dense. Julian can walk you through the executive summaries right now, and we can provide the raw data by tomorrow afternoon." "I do not need the summaries, Marcus," I said politely, offering a razor-thin, chilling smile. "I need the raw data right now. Julian, please project the third quarter Environmental Protection Agency manifests onto the main screen." Julian Vance looked like a deer trapped in the headlights of a speeding freight train. He was sweating profusely. He fumbled with his tablet, his fingers clumsily tapping the screen as he desperately loaded the sanitized, completely falsified documents he had prepared. He pushed the files to the overhead projector, entirely unaware that I had already spent the last 48 hours memorizing every single digital scar, formatting error, and hidden splice in his clumsy forgeries. I sat back in my chair, steepling my fingers as I stared at the giant screen. I watched Julian squirm in his expensive leather seat. I was playing a deeply satisfying, incredibly cruel game of cat and mouse. "Fascinating," I murmured, breaking the suffocating silence in the room. I turned my gaze to Julian, projecting a look of absolute, manufactured admiration. "I have to admit, Julian, when I reviewed the preliminary data room files, I was struck by how drastically you have altered the safety architecture. You have completely removed the redundant verification layers I built." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Yes, well, we felt the old system was too bloated. We needed to be more agile to reduce our operational expenses." "Agile," I repeated, tasting the corporate buzzword. "It is certainly that. You have streamlined the entire process. It is incredibly lean. The cost savings you have generated over the last 6 financial quarters are frankly astonishing. You have managed to cut hazardous waste disposal costs by 60% without triggering a single federal audit flag. That takes a very specific kind of creativity." I watched them closely. Marcus slowly exhaled a breath he had been holding. The rigid tension in Julian's shoulders miraculously dissolved. A sickening, arrogant relief washed over both of their faces. They had completely taken the bait. My polite, complimentary tone had perfectly masked the venom in my words. They actually believed they had outsmarted the Vanguard Praxis auditor. They believed I was genuinely impressed by their fabricated numbers, completely blind to the fact that I had just quietly complimented them on committing a massive federal felony. "Thank you, Brooklyn," Marcus said, his patronizing smirk slowly creeping back onto his face. "Julian has been a tremendous asset to the executive team. We are very proud of the new efficiencies he has introduced." "As you should be," I replied, closing my laptop with a soft, decisive click. "I have seen absolutely everything I need to see for today. The Vanguard Praxis audit is proceeding exactly as anticipated." I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored jacket, and walked out of the boardroom. I left them sitting there, drowning in their own false sense of security, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just meticulously measured them for their coffins. The clock was completely merciless. Exactly 48 hours remained before the Crestview Capital acquisition was scheduled to be finalized. The massive $320 million wire transfer was already queued in a secure escrow account. The celebratory champagne was literally chilling in the executive refrigerators on the top floor, but before the final signatures could be executed and the money released, I initiated a sudden, mandatory, closed-door compliance meeting. I summoned Marcus Thorne and Julian Vance into a windowless interior conference room on the legal floor. There were no windows to look out of. There were no assistants to interrupt us. There was just the suffocating, freezing air of high-stakes corporate finance. I also required the lead attorneys for both Aegis Horizon and Crestview Capital to be physically present in the room to act as official witnesses. Marcus walked in radiating a deeply irritated, condescending arrogance. Julian trailed closely behind him, his baseline anxiety noticeably elevated, his eyes darting around the small room. They took their seats across the heavy mahogany table from me. I opened my leather briefcase and slowly withdrew 2 identical, incredibly thick stacks of high-bond legal paper. I slid one pile directly toward Marcus and pushed the other pile toward Julian. The room fell entirely silent, save for the low mechanical hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice a flat, soothing monotone that perfectly masked the lethal trap I was springing. "Vanguard Praxis requires one final, standard administrative formality before we officially green-light the transaction. It is a completely routine Vanguard policy for an acquisition of this specific financial magnitude." Marcus rolled his eyes, shifting his weight in his expensive chair, visibly annoyed by the procedural delay. "What is it now, Brooklyn?" He sighed heavily. "We have already provided you with every single file, every hidden folder, and every forensic summary your firm requested. The data room has been thoroughly sanitized and verified." "It is a personal liability affidavit," I stated clearly, tapping the top page of the thick document with my index finger. "This legally binds both of you, personally, as the Chief Operating Officer and the primary systems architect, to the absolute authenticity of the Environmental Protection Agency manifests you submitted. By signing this document today, you are swearing under penalty of severe federal perjury that the hazardous materials disposal data provided in the virtual data room is 100% original, unaltered, and completely accurate to the best of your knowledge." Here was the invisible tripwire. It was a flawless, inescapable psychological checkmate. If they refused to sign the affidavit, my Vanguard Praxis audit would immediately fail. The entire $320 million acquisition would be instantly suspended pending a full federal investigation into their accounting practices, their massive executive payouts, worth tens of millions of dollars in vested stock options, would evaporate into thin air right before their eyes. But if they picked up the pen and signed their names, they were no longer just hiding bad numbers in a corporate spreadsheet to inflate a valuation. They were officially, permanently committing a severe federal crime right in front of two elite corporate attorneys. They would be legally stapling their own hands to the forged documents. Julian stared down at the thick document as if it were a highly venomous snake. I saw the absolute panic flashing wildly behind his eyes. He knew exactly what he had done to those PDF files. He knew the digital manipulation he had performed. He looked over at Marcus, his voice trembling slightly, betraying his deep internal terror. "Marcus, perhaps we should have our external legal counsel review the specific liability clauses in this affidavit before we sign anything permanently binding. It seems quite comprehensive." Marcus slammed his hand flat on the table. The sharp, violent crack echoed loudly in the small room, making Julian flinch. Marcus's bottomless greed completely blinded him to the imminent danger. He was mere hours away from securing unimaginable, generational wealth, and he was absolutely not going to let his cowardly, incompetent son-in-law ruin the ultimate payday. "We are not delaying this deal for another entire week just to have lawyers argue over standard corporate boilerplate text," Marcus snapped viciously, his face turning red. He glared at Julian with utter, undisguised contempt. "The data is clean. The system is flawless. We did the work. Sign the damn paper right now. Julian." Julian swallowed hard. The silence in the room returned, deafening and heavy. The Crestview Capital lawyer watched them closely, entirely unaware of the lethal, career-ending drama unfolding right in front of his eyes. Julian's hand shook violently as he reached into his tailored breast pocket and withdrew an expensive gold fountain pen. He slowly uncapped it. He stared at the signature line. He looked back at Marcus, who was already aggressively scrawling his bold signature across the bottom of his own affidavit, defeated and terrified. Julian lowered his pen. The gold nib touched the heavy paper. He signed his name. I watched the black ink bleed deeply into the page. The trap had officially, permanently snapped shut. The criminal past they thought they had successfully buried was now permanently cemented to their financial and legal future. I calmly collected the signed affidavits, checking the signatures, and placed them neatly back into my leather briefcase. Then, with a smooth, almost imperceptible motion hidden under the edge of the mahogany table, I reached into my jacket pocket. I withdrew a small, heavily encrypted metallic flash drive. It contained 3 years of meticulously gathered, undeniable proof of their federal crimes, the original unedited manifests, and the internal emails proving their conspiracy. As the attorneys began packing up their legal pads and briefcases, I leaned over and silently slipped the cold metal drive directly into the hand of the Crestview Capital lead counsel. He looked at me, slightly confused by the covert handoff. I simply offered him a brief, knowing nod. The time bomb was officially armed. The countdown was permanently activated, and there was absolutely zero chance of survival for the men sitting across the table. The final closing meeting took place inside a sprawling, glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor. The space was an absolute temple to corporate excess, offering a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the Seattle skyline. At the center of the room sat a massive, custom-built mahogany table. The atmosphere was thick with the intoxicating, arrogant scent of imminent wealth. The $320 million wire transfer was merely awaiting a final verbal authorization. On a silver tray near the window, crystal flutes were already filled with incredibly expensive vintage champagne. The chief executive officer of Crestview Capital, an older man with silver hair and a tailored suit, stood up at the head of the table. He picked up his champagne flute, a wide, victorious smile spreading across his face. Marcus Thorne and Julian Vance mirrored his eager expression, their eyes gleaming with the anticipation of their massive executive payouts. Chloe from Human Resources stood quietly in the back corner, tasked with organizing the celebratory dinner reservations. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Crestview Chief Executive Officer announced, his voice echoing smoothly across the room. "Today marks the beginning of a highly prosperous new era. I want to personally thank Marcus and Julian for their outstanding leadership in bringing this monumental deal to the finish line, to Aegis Horizon." He raised his glass. Marcus and Julian eagerly reached for theirs. "Before anyone drinks to that," I said. My voice was not loud, but the absolute, freezing authority in my tone cut through the celebratory warmth like a newly sharpened blade. The Chief Executive Officer paused, his glass hovering in midair. Marcus frowned, annoyance flashing across his face. I did not wait for permission. I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and connected my laptop directly to the room's main projection system. The massive smart screen behind the Chief Executive Officer instantly blinked to life. "As the external Chief Compliance Officer representing Vanguard Praxis, I have officially concluded the final diligence audit," I stated, my eyes locking onto Marcus. "And I am officially triggering the material breach clause embedded in the purchase agreement." The room went instantly, violently still. The Crestview Chief Executive Officer slowly lowered his glass, his expression hardening into serious concern. Marcus let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that sounded entirely hollow. "A material breach," Marcus sneered, looking around the room as if I had just told a terrible joke. "What on earth are you talking about? Brooklyn?" "The data room is completely verified. We just signed the liability affidavits 48 hours ago." "Yes," I replied, a slow, predatory smile finally touching my lips. "You certainly did." I tapped a key on my laptop. The projector displayed a massive, incredibly detailed side-by-side forensic analysis. On the left was the flawless Environmental Protection Agency permit Julian had uploaded. On the right was the raw, underlying metadata extracted by Vanguard Praxis software. "What you are looking at is severe federal fraud," I announced, my voice ringing out with surgical precision. "The environmental disposal permits provided by Aegis Horizon are highly sophisticated digital composites. They are completely forged. This company has been illegally dumping thousands of tons of highly volatile, deeply unregulated lithium-ion waste using black market carriers. They did this to artificially slash their operating expenses and falsely inflate the overall company valuation right before this acquisition." "This is an absolute lie," Marcus roared, slamming his fists down onto the mahogany table. His face turned a deep, furious shade of purple. "This is a disgruntled former employee trying to sabotage our transaction. Turn that screen off immediately." I tapped another key. The screen shifted to display a series of brightly highlighted, time-stamped internal emails. "These are the recovered communications between Chief Operating Officer Marcus Thorne and his son-in-law, Julian Vance," I continued, speaking right over his shouting. "These messages explicitly detail the direct orders to bypass the internal safety architecture, forge the federal watermarks, and hide the resulting ecological liabilities from the Crestview Capital auditors." The Crestview lead counsel, the man I had secretly handed the flash drive to, pulled out his phone and rapidly began scrolling through his secure messages. He looked up, his face pale with shock, and nodded urgently to his chief executive officer. The evidence had already been fully verified by their internal crisis team. "Because of this catastrophic deception," I said, projecting my voice across the dead, silent room, "Vanguard Praxis has recalculated the true value of Aegis Horizon, factoring in the imminent, massive federal cleanup fines. The adjusted valuation drops the purchase price by exactly 35%. Over $112 million has just evaporated from this deal." Marcus looked as though he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. The oxygen seemed to instantly vanish from the room, but I was not finished. I had saved the sharpest swing of the guillotine for last. Furthermore, I stated, turning my gaze directly to the trembling figure of Julian Vance, because both of you willfully signed the personal liability affidavits swearing to the authenticity of these forged documents, you have completely insulated the purchasing company from your crimes. But more importantly, you have officially voided your own executive employment contracts. Every single cent of your golden parachutes, your severance packages, and your vested stock options are hereby canceled, effective immediately. Julian let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. His knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily back into his leather chair, his hands covering his face as he began to hyperventilate. He was watching his entire life disintegrate in real time. "You cannot do this to me," Marcus shrieked, entirely losing his mind. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful executive was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He lunged toward me, spit flying from his lips. "I built this company. You are nothing. You are a fired middle manager. Your digital forensic files and the signed liability affidavits were transmitted to the federal authorities 30 minutes ago," I informed him, my voice colder than ice. "I suggest you retain high-level criminal defense counsel. Marcus, you are going to need it." In the back corner of the room, Chloe was pressing herself flat against the glass wall. She was trembling so violently that the folder in her hands was shaking visibly. She stared at the floor, absolutely terrified to make eye contact with me, finally understanding the true cost of her industrial smile. I calmly closed my laptop. The projector screen went dark. The room was filled only with the sound of Julian's frantic sobbing and Marcus's heavy, panicked breathing. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against the cold metal I had carried with me for over 3 years. I pulled my hand out and placed the objects carefully onto the polished mahogany table, directly in front of where Marcus was standing. It was exactly 65 cents, a single quarter, 3 dimes, and 2 nickels. "Consider that my final reimbursement for the ID badge clip," I said softly. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the absolute ruin I had meticulously engineered and walked out of the boardroom. I strode down the long, quiet hallway, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I stepped into the glass elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to slide shut, I looked out through the massive windows. The sky over Seattle was painted in brilliant, fiery shades of orange and gold as the sun began to set. It was a completely bloodless execution, but it was perfectly, undeniably fatal. The elevator descended, and I left them all entirely in the dark. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in and listening to this incredible story today. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Please drop your city or country down in the comments. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget. If you felt the satisfaction of today's story and want to help us keep bringing you these high-quality narratives, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. Over there, we have an entire vault of our absolute best, highly exclusive true stories featuring incredible emotional voice acting that we simply cannot post on YouTube. You can join our community right now by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct Patreon link in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again for your amazing support, and I will see you in the next story.